Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is my pleasure to moderate today's discussion on militarism and gender equality in the Middle East and North African region. By the way, I'm Adem Mirzai, a retired faculty of Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Because of the unfortunate ongoing wars, the topic is more important and urgent than ever. This is the first event organized by Ad Hoc Committee on the Middle East and North Africa with support from Online Committee and IAFI staff. The Ad Hoc Committee on MENA region is also working on organizing MENA-focused sessions during the IAFI annual conference in Rome. We hope to see you all there too. Today's session will last for 90 minutes with 2 presentations followed by discussion and Q&A at the end. The event is recorded and will be posted on YouTube channel afterwards. Interpretation to Arabic is available in the Spanish channel. Since Zoom doesn't have Arabic channel, we are using Spanish channel. Please feel free to post your questions and comments on chat during the session, but we will get to them after the presentations, mainly during last 30 minutes of this event. Our first speaker that I have honor to present is Dr. Adem Elveren, a feminist economist and a political scientist from American University in Bulgaria. Welcome, Adem. The floor is yours, please.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen. I hope everyone can see, right? Okay. First, I would like to start with this picture or photo I came across months ago. If you take just maybe 30 seconds to look at the details, you are going to see lots of things to talk about. But my goal is not to talk over this photo. I believe Jennifer will actually fill those gaps. Here, my goal in this presentation is to sort of draw a very general framework regarding the relationship between military spending, economic growth, with special attention to gender inequality. But when I came across with this photo, I thought if it was a sort of like a work about the feminist political economy perspective in terms of the guns and butter in economic thoughts, we could actually name this like girls make butter, boys play with guns. And here in this slide, so I would like to continue with the other main economic thoughts. How do they approach to this guns and butter argument? For example, if we are talking about neoclassical perspective, basically it is invisible hand, visible arm. And if you are talking about the military industrial complex or the liberal school in general, then I thought it is better to define the military industrial complex, the visible finger of the invisible hand on the trigger. And finally, we can also talk about the Marxist perspective. Here, maybe guns for oil or oil for gas. So this is not my presentation, but I would like to start with this general introduction. So here's my, and of course, I'm going to skip this parts too, how militarization impacts gender inequality, both in war and peace times. And of course, we need to acknowledge that, maybe it doesn't make sense to detach these two issues from each other because it's a continuing process. Again, In fact, my job is here in this easy in this presentation because I believe Jennifer will be talking about them. So therefore, I skip this very general categorization I come up with, open to discussion. I intentionally put question mark here because the impact of war on labor force participation deserves more attention. But what's my goal? Here's my goal. When we look at military spending, growth and gender inequality, it is, I think, important to understand the relationship between them. There is this, impact from military spending to economic growth, and mainly scholars from defense and peace economics deal with this issue. And as far as I know, there are at least 300 empirical works try to understand this relationship, and the result seems inconclusive, but a careful literature review suggests that the most recent studies, and particularly those who use like the more advanced econometric methods, have tendency to find negative impact. That means higher military spending is likely to reduce economic growth. And when we look at the relationship between gender inequality and growth, or gender equality and growth, and of course this is a bi-directional relationship, I'm sure the audience very well know that both neoclassical economics and feminist economics deals with this issue. And finally, the impact of military spending on gender inequality, studied by scholars from international relations and security studies, or maybe I should add feminists in front of this literature. And then what's my goal? What am I going to talk about? My goal was to better understand this relationship. It is, I think, very important. And particularly if I focus on scholars, their work on defense and peace economics, of course, they ignore gender inequality. They don't pay attention to this indirect impact of military spending on economic growth. So basically, I'm going to talk about the studies that I had chance to work with Valentina Mokata, and in another follow-up study, Selda Dudu joined us as well. There, our goal was to show that, okay, there's highly comprehensive theoretical discussion regarding this relationship, and we try to find empirical evidence. And later, I try to see, okay, how can we explain the impact of military spending on economic growth by considering this very important issue, it is impact on gender inequality. So then I'm also going to talk about these two more studies, not in detail. I'm not trying to talk about those detailed econometric issues. Of course, if you have time, I would be happy to answer the questions. But the first one was a pure theoretical approach. The second one was trying to provide empirical evidence to it. Let me maybe skip this part very fast. I believe everybody is aware of this gender inequality index. And of course, I acknowledge that, in fact, in a sense, it doesn't make sense to try to operationalize a concept like militarism or militarization. But our goal was simple. So that's why we try to use this global militarization index, which has three elements. And of course, in addition to that, we also try to see, how military spending as a share of GDP or as a share of budget affects. I'm going to skip this part. We can come back if we have time. Again, it's not my goal to get lost in the details of this table, and that's why I highlighted here. Basically, it tells that higher global militarization is associated with higher gender inequality. And this is a very significant, very consistent result, independent from country groups or economic development level, and it continues with the other model specification. Here, maybe I would like to add one more thing, because it is also important to see if there are more seats taken by women parliaments, and if that impacts, if that affects the gender inequality. There are some studies arguing that when women hold more seats in the parliament, it leads to less military spending. That means more, spending on education and health. In fact, here we provided sort of, additional evidence that it is true. There is such a significant association. Again, perhaps we can discuss that as well. That's not always the case, and it's an important discussion. And I would like to skip that part as well. I don't know how am I doing in terms of time, but this is the second part of that, my initial framework that I was trying to show: military spending, economic growth, and gender inequality. So this study that recently published in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, that was my aim, to explain that relationship with a pure structural model. But I think this is very important, so I have to make this point perfectly clear that maybe entire credit should go to Özlem Onaran, Cem Oyvat, and I just apologize, probably I can't pronounce right, but Fotopoulou. I am telling this because my model was a very practical way of adopting their model, which was very comprehensive. So they were dealing with three sectors. I just drop it to two and make it military and civilian to understand if $1 spent on military and civilian, if they are going to have different impact on economic growth. So that was the goal of this model at theoretical level. And there are reasons to think that the very same dollar may have different impacts. First of all, we are talking about different marginal propensities to consume. And the second one is that women are mostly, of course, in a relative sense, they are not, their employment level is very, very low when it comes to military sector. And I apologize here, Milex, of course, I try to refer military expenditures. So here, I know it's a long sentence, but let me read. Here it says, both civilian government and military expenditures have a positive effect on growth in the short term because it is part of the aggregate demand. But the model suggests that when we focus on the long run, it is likely that the impact of military expenditures will be smaller compared to the impact of civilian expenditures. And it is because of two reasons: the different marginal propensity to consume, and also because of the different levels of employment in civilian and military sectors. So I'm about to finish my presentation. So this is the last study to sort of complete this.
Adem, you do have time. I just briefed the introduction to give you guys more time. Just don't rush through your points. Just make your point. I can give you at least another 10 more minutes, or maybe around 10.
I'm glad to hear that. In fact, maybe with this sort of introduction, you allow me to say something very sincere. So in fact, I have a stage anxiety, believe it or not. I have been teaching since 2005, but
we are all here for you. Take your
yes.
time. The topic is very interesting. You have done a great job. We would like you to explain it to us.
Thank you. And yes, hopefully with this presentation, I will beat that stage anxiety, which actually makes me speak very fast. So I apologize for that, but I'm glad that I have more time. So maybe I should slow down and go back to maybe add a few more things to the discussion. So let me repeat in general. So my goal was to emphasize that the relationship between military spending and economic growth is important. Of course, military spending itself, militarization itself is very important, but it was sort of like critical perspective to defense and peace economics, which keeps studying the impact of military spending on economic growth, basically by using very neoclassical models. That means they just try to consider military expenditure as a part of the government expenditure, which means it is part of the aggregate demand. Therefore, you should expect that higher militarization, military index, or military spending, creates more demand in the sense of military Keynesianism. And therefore, we should expect that this is going to lead economic growth. But there were two problems with this understanding. Number one, the mechanism is not that simple. In fact, as I said, if we focus on the most recent studies, those use like the more advanced econometric methods, the literature review suggests that actually most of those studies find that higher military spending reduces economic growth. So that's the one problem. That means actually the impact is negative. Another problem is that this understanding just focus on this direct impact, but it is very important to also consider that militarization affects gender inequality as well. And through that effect, there is indirect effect on the economic growth. So that was my goal. And the first part, my research with dear Valentina Moghatam, it basically shows that yes, higher militarization, higher military spending, either as a share of GDP or budget, no matter how we measure it, it doesn't change. It is significantly related with gender inequality. That means militarization leads to higher gender inequality. Of course, democracy, the level of democracy reduce this negative impact. Of course, economic development matters because it creates more job for women. And then in the second part, the part that I am focusing right now, tries to understand more this direct and indirect impacts together. So the first part, that when I introduced that model and try to give full credit to Özlem Onaran and Cem Olmat and their co-author, I just in a very practical way, I adopt that model to show that this indirect impact. And finally, in this slide, in another follow-up paper, that is an ongoing study. It's an empirical exercise to see whether we can show this direct and indirect impact. So I'm not going to discuss details, not because of the time constraint, but because I think it is not necessary. So basically, what we are trying to do is we are trying to explain economic growth in terms of military burden. That means military share in the GDP, and gender inequality. Also, we try to explain gender inequality as a function of military expenditure. And finally, of course, military expenditure has its own determinants as well. So, and I know this table is even more confusing, but again, my goal is to just focus on this most important variables. Not in this particular table, but in another table, we can see that actually military burden has a significant and negative side, meaning that higher military expenditure is likely to reduce economic growth, which is in line with many studies, many other studies in the literature. But also more importantly, we found that higher gender inequality is also negatively associated with economic growth. I know that literature is very broad. We can discuss that, whether gender inequality leads to higher economic growth or not. But in this study, we found negative relationship. But to finish my presentation, I would like to emphasize that the basic contribution of this study was to show that when we consider gender inequality, when we consider the impact of military spending on gender inequality, in fact, the negative impact of military spending on economic growth is even more negative. And how we can explain that? In a sense, it is very simple. In a sense, not. I think it is simple in the sense that because higher military spending reduces the productive capacity of the economy. Therefore, that negative impact, if it is, becomes even larger in the long run. And perhaps that's a very important issue because when it comes to policy recommendations, some studies have tendency to find a positive impact because, as we all know, when it comes to empirical studies, they come with their own disadvantage because a slight change in the model or time period or country groups may lead to totally different outcome. But I think the key issue is here maybe to make sure which time period we are talking about, short run versus long run. That is one conclusion of that study. But in general, I would like to summarize my discussion by saying that, yes, development and level of democracy is associated with lower gender inequality or higher gender equality. But there was one sort of issue, perhaps it deserves more discussion. That's not my goal, but I would like to hear from the audience as well, because this very clear relationship is not valid when it comes to high-income countries. Myself and Valentina Mogatam's argument was because high-income countries also involve Islamic and MENA countries, some of which are rich countries. Maybe that is one reason that the results are not clear. The other problem, of course, the study suffers from the dependent variable, which is gender inequality index. And particularly when you focus on advanced countries, the change in the index is very minor. So it's mostly sort of like the stable. Maybe it was also due to that fact. But my point is that perhaps high-income countries maybe deserves more research or discussion. And of course, no need to tell that when you consider the additional impact of war and conflict, that also very clear that it increases gender inequality. That is, as I mentioned, it was additional, additional evidence that if you are talking about higher share of women parliament members, it is related with declining militarization and gender inequality. And finally, yes, military burden reduces economic growth, and particularly this happens in the long run because of its impact, its negative impact on gender equality. I think that was my plan. I apologize. I started very fast. Hopefully, I managed to slow down, but I will be happy to clarify if we have chance, if I have chance. So thanks so much. Ida, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Adem. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Olmsted. She is professor of economics at Drew University in the US. Her research is focused on socioeconomic conditions facing women in Arab countries. She has some work on conflict in the Middle East, the impact of the conflict. I give the floor to her to explain more on her current research and also on the topic. Jennifer, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to see many names that I recognize among the guests and also many new people. So welcome to everybody. Let me just start the formal presentation. And I just want to say I have actually been studying Arab conflict since the late 1980s. So this is actually really not going to be a presentation of a single article. It's really going to be a summary of a lot of empirical research done by myself as well as other scholars. But before I start, I actually want to ask for a minute of silence, given the situation right now in Palestine. As many of you probably have been following, there are now 18,787 deaths and over 50,000 injured, and 85% of the population is displaced, which is, I think, a record. There's also been a blockade imposed, which has caused severe hunger and food shortages, and less in the news, but there's been a real rise in settler violence in the West Bank. So this presentation is against that backdrop. I also thought it was worth reminding everybody during this holiday season that this is where Christ was born, for those who follow a Christian tradition. And this is a piece by Banksy where he shows the Holy Family in front of the wall that's now been built in Bethlehem. I also think it's worth noting that the Gazans very much speak of solidarity and think of their struggle as linked to other struggles. So this is a mural that was placed in, was in Gaza. I don't know if it still exists. All right, let's turn to some more. I'm going to give a lot of background because I don't know the level of background that people have. I know some of you are scholars of armed conflict and some of you are probably new to this. These are UNHCR statistics, so you can see how much of a crisis we have in terms of refugees. And I think it's also worth looking at where most of these refugees are being hosted. And if you look at the host countries, you'll note that only one of these host countries is in Western Europe, and that's Germany. And this is a recent addition because Germany opened up a humanitarian corridor, and so their numbers rose. But historically, as noted by the UNHCR, 76% of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries, and 70% are hosted in neighboring countries. So I think it's worth thinking about who bears the burden. And I'm going to speak mostly about the direct costs of conflict, but there's also a lot of spillover effects, which I think is, something, Adem, to think a little bit more, because militarism doesn't just affect the country you're in, but it also has spillover effects. So trying to think about econometrically how we can capture spillover effects, I think, is an interesting addition to some of your work. I think it's also really sobering, and this was from mid-2016 because I like this graphic better than the more recent one, but the numbers haven't changed. In Lebanon, 17% of the population are refugees. That is just an unfathomable number, that almost 20% of your population is refugees. The Jordan numbers are actually wrong because they do not include all the Palestinians who were displaced in 1948. So they only include the most recent waves of refugees. Jordan has absorbed actually 3 major waves: Palestine twice, then Iraq, and now most recently Syria. But when you go to Lebanon and Jordan, and when you talk to UN workers on the ground, they'll tell you that there's actually a lot of other refugees in the mix as well, Yemenis and people from other conflicts. So a little bit more background on the region. I think it's fairly well known that the two, oil and water are the two big crises around which a lot of has been written, and they are linked to some of the conflicts in the region. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the colonial legacies, but I think this is very important. And I also think it's important to think about how diverse the region is. It's actually, and Adem referred to this as well, you have some of the very, very rich Arab emirate countries, and then you have some of the poorest countries in the world. I'm not going to click on these links. Those are there for if you find them useful. But I tried to think of cluster the countries. There's resource-rich, small population resource-rich, large, middle income, and then poor. But what I think is actually noteworthy is, and I put stars for the countries that had more historic armed conflict, and then 2 stars for those that are much more recent conflict. And what's really striking is how much of the region has had to experience armed conflict. And again, I don't think this is necessarily the fault of the region. It comes because of a lot of colonial legacies. I actually put Iran in 2 categories because Iran is resource rich, but they've actually, since they've been under sanctions, they've actually diversified, and they're actually a fairly diverse industrial-based economy as well. But it's worth thinking about the fact that also I put parentheses around Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria because their middle income status is seriously compromised right now in the context of what's happening in all 3 of those countries. And one more note, notice that all the poor agriculturally based countries who also have high fertility are conflict zones. So really, if you look at, and one can talk about causality for this. I'm not doing an econometric analysis, but conflict certainly keeps countries poor, which I will talk about later. Again, I'm just going to skip over this, but I think it's important to think about the legacies of colonialism and the Cold War, which has created a lot of border disputes and geopolitical tensions. Adem already mentioned militarism. Obviously, there are also internal conflicts, some of them quote unquote religious, some of them political tensions, left, right, secular, religious. But for me as an economist, and I learned this when I was growing up in Lebanon, and I could see that even though the Lebanese conflict was being defined as a religious conflict, it was really about resource control and who was able to maintain economic power. I pulled this together a few years ago. I hope it's still current. Pardon me if it's not. But I think, so one of the myths in the literature is that sanctions are an alternative to armed conflict. But what's striking about the region is that so many countries have had to deal with so many different forms of violence. So sanctions for me is a form of economic violence, which is in the West is portrayed as an alternative to armed conflict, but it's actually a very, very economically painful phenomenon. And if you notice, most of the countries that have been sanctioned also have had either foreign intervention, military occupation, and or domestic disputes. So to talk about these conflicts as domestic issues is just a myth, because you have, I mean, when I actually put this table together, I was actually really struck because I didn't realize how many foreign occupations were going on. People talk about Israel-Palestine as a foreign occupation, but if you look at the history of occupations, it's fairly significant in the region, but also foreign intervention. And again, I haven't updated this, but there's just been a lot of foreign involvement in the region as well. So finally, we get to the feminist part of this. So what are feminists interested in? I've put together a list. I don't want to read the whole thing, but obviously we're interested in gaps between men and women and boys and girls, whether that's around nutrition, education, poverty, access to work, obviously, is a big one. And then over on the right-hand side, the invisibility of unpaid work, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes, the gender division of labor, which is related, obviously, the role of social safety nets, and then the role of government and religious institutions. So I'm going to focus a lot on the left-hand column, but I'm also going to make some comments about the right-hand column as much as I can in the context of armed conflict. I also think, and this, it's great that Adem and I were able to do this, but one of the things one learns when one works on armed conflict is what a dearth there is in the literature. There are so many areas where we really need to focus more on militarism. Adem's doing work on military spending. There's a dearth of work on the impacts of armed conflict. I've done quite a bit of work on economic sanctions and how these have gendered impacts in the context of Iraq, Iran, and Palestine. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'd be happy to address that in the Q&A. Around the refugee crisis, there's gendered analysis that still needs to be done. And also, very importantly, and often neglected, is what happens in terms of post-conflict redevelopment. A lot of the times when you're in the middle of a humanitarian crisis, the UN is told that they have to use a gender lens. But we find that when we're talking about post-conflict redevelopment, there's very little attention to how would you rebuild a society through a feminist lens, and what would you think about? So that's a big area where there's gaps in the literature. Part of the problem is, of course, data challenges. If you're a conflict-ridden country and you're already resource-strapped, you're not going to prioritize gender data. And Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen all have severe data challenges. And collecting data is certainly not a priority during conflict, and gender disaggregation is even less of a priority. But it's also true that governments may suppress certain data because they find it challenging their narrative. And some of the statistics that we really need around gender-based violence, for example, or around what's happening with gender norms are very culturally sensitive, so they're hard to quantify. So just that is one of the reasons why economists don't necessarily focus on, because we're so data-driven in terms of much of our analysis. So I've just come up with a summary of what the impact of violent conflict is. Obviously, there's severe economic disruption and hardship. There's also increases in violence and lawlessness separate from the military. So you have the military conflict, but you also often have criminal elements that emerge during conflicts. You have a loss of both social and human capital due to both death and flight, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And that one has very serious long-term consequences. You have massive infrastructural damage, which we know as economists, if you lose your infrastructure, it's very hard for your economy to function. You have government spending diverted, which Adem has already touched on. I touched on the displacement of populations. I think what's really important to think about through a feminist lens is the breakdown in the social fabric and the mental health challenges. And that is an area where economists have not done a lot of work. And then there's a lot of evidence from long-term conflicts like Iraq that you can have gender norms changes that occur. And this is partly out of survival strategies and other reasons. Each one of these points that I've made can be examined through a gender lens. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to touch on all of them. And I mentioned in my opening remarks, Adem already talked about escalated military spending, but I think this spillover to neighboring countries is really important. Usually your trading partners are your neighbors. So trading partners are going to be disrupted by war. And then the refugee crisis, I'm not focusing on that today, but a lot of my work has looked at the impact on Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, for example, of the displacement of the Syrians. It creates a strain on services, inflation, and it's not clear what the impact of growth is when you have a big refugee influx, but it's a massive macroeconomic shock. So this is probably, I have two really important slides. This is one of them. Again, this is a summary of all the literature out there. I wanted to add some of the names of the authors who've done this, but I didn't have time because I've been trying to finish my grading. So nutrition, as we're seeing in the Gaza situation right now, food security is often very, very severely impacted by wars. Armies often use food as a weapon. What's interesting is that we don't have empirical evidence that there's gender discrimination around food access. Of course, part of the problem is everybody is having reduced food access. So you see rise in malnutrition, you see rises in stunting, but it's not necessarily clear that girls are more disadvantaged than boys. This is like a bad news story because it's basically saying you don't have gender inequality, but everybody's worse off, right? It's a sinking ship, sadly. There's some very good empirical evidence that looks at life expectancy, and it is true that men are more likely to die directly from violence, but women are much more likely to suffer from longer-term effects, and particularly infrastructure destruction. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about maternal mortality, which is a particular concern. It is very important to have good infrastructure for that. Poverty rates go up, not surprisingly, and again, there's limited research on this, but there's definitely an argument that a feminization of poverty is likely to emerge, in part because men are dying directly from violence. But again, I want to focus on the right-hand side, because this is where the macroeconomic implications, not just the micro human rights aspect, but the macroeconomic implications come in. There's a whole discussion in the literature on armed conflict that talks about lost generations. Often in the context of armed conflicts, parents have more education than their children, which imagine the macroeconomic implications of that. The empirical evidence is mixed around gender discrimination in this. In some country contexts, so for example, in Iraq, as boys and girls got pulled out of schools, because girls already had lower educational achievements, it actually brought boys' education down to the level that girls were at. Again, it's this sort of a bad news story. We have a lack of gender discrimination, but it's actually because boys are actually losing out more than girls. Obviously, bodily integrity is a highly gendered topic. And that has, for women, access to contraceptive, access to maternal health is really important. And you can think about both the destruction of infrastructure, but also pronatalism often is on the rise in the context of conflicts. So, and then freedom from violence. Feminists have pushed in recent years to have rape considered a war crime. Although rape is more likely to affect, rape does affect men and boys as well as women and girls, but we know that the most impact is on women and girls. And then there's, obviously you want to think about the access to work. Unemployment usually rises in the context of armed conflict, informal work rises, and women are particularly vulnerable both to job loss and to turning to survival strategies such as sex work. And then last but certainly not least, there's very little data on unpaid care work because, time use studies already are not very prolific, but there's definitely anecdotal evidence. And if you think about this theoretically, it must be the case that care labor burdens go up. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two. But first, I just wanted to quickly talk about maternal mortality. I put these together a few years ago, so the data are a little bit old, but I think this is a very stark showing of what happened in Iraq as a result of both sanctions and extensive conflict. You can see how maternal mortality rates have been on the decline in the region, but they completely flattened out in the context of Iraq during the conflict. Now, let's see if I can get this to work. Mumbi, I may need your help with this. Oh, no. Can you see, is my screen showing the graphic, the new graphic, or is it still showing the PowerPoint? No,
it is showing the link. It's not showing.
Okay, let me stop. I'm gonna stop sharing and then reshare. I forgot that this, I know how to do this because I was doing this during COVID, but so I just, So again, you see a massive decline, and I saw in the text some colleagues were commenting about the horrible situation in Sudan. If you look at the region, Sudan has the highest maternal mortality, and obviously in part of that is being driven by both poverty and conflict. But I want to go down to this second graphic. This is showing, now Iraq has sort of smoothed out a little bit. But if you look at Iran has had a slight increase, and one wonders if that's related to, I'm sorry, this is Yemen. Yemen has had a big increase. Yemen has sort of flattened out and now it's rising up. Syria, there's been an up dip. It's a little bit hard to see here, but you can see it over here in the table. So basically maternal mortality is one of the higher, not being able to reduce your maternal mortality, and sometimes even having a rise in maternal mortality, is a consequence of conflict, which is actually understudied. Like I was looking for some good quantitative analyses of this, and I was kind of surprised to not find anything. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So again, sort of a summary of the impacts of conflict. And then for me, a lot of my work works on the concept of sustainability. So thinking about how armed conflict really undermines sustainability. First, you have injury and death, hunger, health challenges, educational challenges. So you have all these short-term problems with attaining the sustainability goals, obviously. But if you think about the long-term impacts, that's where it really gets very sad to think about, because you have massive human and social capital challenges. As I talked about the lost generation, think about the macroeconomic impact that has. Once you have poverty kicking in, how do you extract yourself from that cycle of poverty? How do you extract yourself from the cycle of violence? And again, each of these can be thought of through a gender lens. Like when you're in a post-conflict rebuilding stage, are you thinking about the fact that men and women may have different needs in terms of rebuilding society? And I think the one that's the most important for me is the lasting effects of trauma. There's actually a very interesting study by Rand that showed that PTSD leads to an inability to parent effectively. I haven't seen a lot of studies of the ability to function economically, but we do know, for example, people who are traumatized, people who are victims of domestic violence, for example, are less able to function economically. It's got to be the case that if you're suffering from trauma and you are really trying to recover your life, that's going to affect your functionality economically. But there's very little research on this. And again, getting back to the gendered consequences, there absolutely have to be both short-term and long-term care labor consequences of conflict, even though we don't have the data to show it. Just to think about this in one way, if you're a woman and you're traumatized, but you're also having to take care of partners, children, parents who are also traumatized, imagine the additional burden that has given to traditional gender norms around care labor. So there's been very little work thinking about the long-term effects of trauma and the care labor consequences of this, but I think it's a very important area of research. So I just wanted to say these are some things that I've identified as future projects. Again, we don't have enough quantitative analysis of the how employment is affected by conflict. We don't have enough on maternal mortality. I didn't touch on child marriage. There's more work on child marriage. That's been actually something that the UN has been focused on. Very little work modeling the short and long-term macroeconomic costs of armed conflict. And also thinking about tipping points. When do countries spiral into conflict, and then how do you get them out and how do you get them back on a good track? And more generally, theorizing the links between gender, conflict, development, and sustainability. I just wanted to put a shout out for a much less depressing topic that I'm also working on, which is a project that NYU, with a colleague at NYU, looking at Arab women in computing. It turns out that Arab women are some of the leaders in computing, and they have like 50% rates of studying computing. So I just wanted to end on a more positive note. I have three more slides. This is from Lebanon. This is the Holiday Inn.
One more minute.
I literally have 2 more slides. This is a picture from Lebanon, and it's still standing. It's from it was a hotel built in 1975, but it just shows you the long-term consequences. And I actually wanted to end not on the Middle East, but on another context. Between 64 and 73, US dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. And many of those bombs still haven't exploded, so you have unexploded ordnance. These are some aerial photos of what Laos looks like. And this is like 30 years later. This is a bomb crater, 30 years after. So I think it's important to think about, this is the resilience. So the people in Laos took all of this military hardware and they actually used it for dual use. So they used it in their agriculture. But I just wanted to say that war has long-term consequences, which we as economists still don't have a very good understanding of, both from a micro and a macroeconomic perspective. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Yelda Yücel, a macroeconomist in Istanbul Bilgi University in Turkey, will discuss the topic and reflect on the presentations. Yelda, please.
Thank you, Ida. It's a great session, and I'm very happy to be part of it. Although I do not directly work in this area, I benefited very much from my colleagues' presentations and also their previous studies. I studied and read some of the writings of them, and it really it opened up a new vision for me in the area. Because the presentation so far was complementing each other very well, and they provided an extensive vision, both theoretically and empirically. They described the complexity of the issue and pointed to policies that were in place. The problem is very timely and urgent today, and especially for those of us to take action against the armed conflicts and engaged in peace-building processes. This session was really very helpful. Adem's theoretical macro modeling of military expenditures and his empirical findings identified the military sector's direct and indirect macroeconomic implications on gender equality, growth, and other aggregates. Jennifer took the discussion from where he left off and developed it towards how these relations and actual armed conflicts affected the lives of the people in health, education, employment, especially the women, vis-a-vis the country cases and field research findings. Jennifer showed not only the gendered consequences of militarism, but also the short and often unpredicted, as she said, long-run outcomes leading to the deep deteriorations in the well-being of women, children, elderly, and other vulnerable groups. Adem showed remarkably, really, that the military spending reduced productive capacities in the economy in the long run, reinforced gender inequalities, crowded out social expenditures, and crowded in activities in men-dominated sectors, and promoted male employment against women's. These are all time-valid relations, regardless of the origin of the country, but MENA region deserves special attention, definitely, as Adem showed in his estimations that all MENA dummies were significant. He also pointed out, but he didn't emphasize in his speech, in his tables, he pointed out that the corruption and militarism cohabit together, and they intensify the patriarchy that exploits women's paid and unpaid labor. Jennifer discussed with concrete examples of how long-term consequences of militarism take the form of intergenerational consequences of poverty, unemployment, loss of productivity, and well-being, changing gender relations with the possibility of both positive and negative outcomes. These were some of the takeaways that I took from these discussions. MENA region, however, is composed of, as Jennifer already pointed at the beginning of her speech, is composed of diverse economies and social and cultural structures. So the region is not only subject to different military conflicts with different severity, but also it's characterized by shocks from, it's also subject to shocks from commodity price fluctuations, currency volatilities, often currency depreciations feeding into inflationary environment of the post-COVID era. So the growth of GDP is very volatile for the whole region. And there are also differentiations between oil exporters and oil importers. They need to be treated definitely differently because of the structures of their economy are prone to different gendered structures. They include, so their structures, frameworks, policies designed also have different consequences for gender. Oil exporters are enjoying trade surpluses, whereas oil importers like Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, West Bank, Gaza suffer from twin deficits in the trade and current account and fiscal balances. And the world financial conditions are pretty constrained after the pandemic. Those countries with high current account deficits rely on foreign financing for their economies, which add to the challenges they face. Foreign exchange pressures lead to currency depreciations in those countries, accelerating the inflation rates. Inflation rates are exceptionally high in countries like Iran and Algeria, oil exporters, in oil importers like Egypt and Tunisia. And in Egypt, depreciation of the local currency was found to have a substantial effect on inflation. Food inflation, especially, is a threat to food security. Among the most vulnerable households, researchers, as you all know, find that inflation of low-income households is higher than that of upper-income households due to the higher share of household budgets allocated to necessities in low-income families. And except for high-income countries, MENA countries are characterized by high unemployment rates, even during good times, and extensive informal employment. The situation gets worse when the region is faced with an economic shock. The World Bank report recently released finds that the increase in unemployment in MENA during economic downturns is double that of other emerging markets and developing countries. And unemployment in the region contributes to long-term losses in the well-being of individuals through increasing probabilities of lower incomes, loss of skills, transitioning to informal jobs, or being stuck in those jobs. So the variations in the economies of countries result in different gendered outcomes too. Labor force participation and unemployment rates not only differ between high-income countries and others, but also within the countries in the region. In middle and lower income MENA, for example, the unemployment rates for women are high and higher than men, but also labor force participation ranges from being 1/10 to at best 1/3 of male labor force participation. For example, women's unemployment is 40% in West Bank and Gaza, in contrast to 20% for men. So considering these fragilities and structural problems in the region, wars and arms conflict deepen these vulnerabilities, further threaten the immediate and long-term well-being of men and women, children and elderly, and cause problems to take root. Women will take more of a toll from this deterioration in their well-being and the loss in the dignified life. Country-specific effects will be different, shaped by given economic framework, institutions, and fragilities in the economy. So coming to the session, after having outlined so much economic structures of the region, papers in this session serve to comprehend the complexity of the ongoing conflicts in the region escalated by the most recently Israel war against Hamas. Jennifer showed some of the numbers, and the UNDP report in November says that 61% of employment in Gaza and 24% of employment in West Bank disappeared in 1 month. Half of the housing, 40% of education facilities were damaged or destroyed. Also, the report argues that there will be a loss already of 11 to 16 years in human development, as both my colleagues said, because of the loss of infrastructure. So Jennifer discussed in her speech not only the armed conflict, but the coping strategies during these times result in more women and children being hurt and affected, fleeing displacements, exploitation in labor markets, increase in child marriages, loss of incomes, sale of assets. So the humanitarian crisis is, these are only a few reflections of how the humanitarian crisis is realized. So some of the lessons I draw from today's presentation are: we need urgent, sound policies for peace building. Women who are missing in peace building negotiations to date must be part of these processes. Women's return to labor markets and social life in the recovery should be prioritized in policy frameworks. Informal sectors and reproductive spheres must be part of post-conflict recovery policies, and work-life balance policies and fiscal policies should be designed accordingly. Last but not least, this should be handled. It's not only a national policy, it's a global macroeconomic governance issue that is a very challenging task ahead. So many tasks await us in this matter. We should start thinking about peace economics and build models to analyze how peace as a public good promotes economic performance, well-being, and gender equality. Studies could address incorporating the reproduction. So this was one of Adem's point in one of his articles, that incorporation of reproduction in macro models of defense and peace economics is something that we should in the near term do. See how these things mattered in specific sectors like labor markets, informal and formal, and different dimensions of individual capabilities and well-being. And as the number of country-specific studies increases, we will be able to offer more concrete and targeted policies. So maybe it's a bit long discussion so far. Thank you for all who helped who helped hold today's session. And maybe I will give the floor to Ida for Q&A session. But a question for Adem: do you have any observations on fiscal policies enacted by countries to offset adverse impacts of the military spending you described on women's well-being? So do you have any observations on the fiscal policies enacted to counteract by countries to offset adverse impacts of military spending? Maybe Jennifer could also elaborate a little bit more on long-term impacts and also what policies should be in place to remedy these long-term impacts, and what is the role for feminist organizations and researchers like us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Yalda. It's very interesting and good discussion. And all speakers did fabulous, and I'm very thankful and glad being part of this panel. We move to Q&A. Before giving the stage to Adem and Jennifer to answer questions Yalda brought up, we have one question on chat on the role of non-state actors in conflict. Whoever has this question, I didn't check the name. Could you please unmute yourself and talk if you want to? We would like to, and then raise your hands, anyone from audience who want to ask questions. We would like to give you time actually to unmute yourself and ask question. And from presenter side, whoever either question is directed or have an answer, they will jump in and answer the question. Okay. Now,
there's a hand raised.
I see Haron's hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks, Ida. First of all, I want to thank Adem and Jennifer and Yalda for their, very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations. I don't have a question, I have a comment, which really emerges from Jennifer's very last point when she talked about the role of trauma and thinking about, more about the interrelationship between trauma, care, and militarism. And the point I want to make is not so much about those things, which are obviously very, very important, but to highlight the emerging issue that we have of intergenerational trauma and the way in which the study of epigenetics can point to traumas having multi-generational consequences. And if I think about what's happened in the past 25 years in Iraq, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Sudan, I mean, the prospects for intergenerational traumas, which have impacts upon social norms, upon care responsibilities, but also macroeconomic consequences over the long term. It seems to me it's a very important frontier area of thinking about this kind of subject area. That's all I wanted to say. And thanks again for a really excellent presentation.
Thank you. So how about, I don't have any more questions yet on chat. How about one of you or both of you comment on non-state actors' role in conflict as it is asked on chat, and also answer Yelda's question. Thank you.
Should I just jump in?
Please.
When I often use the Heidelberg conflict barometer for the question about Nigeria. I think the Heidelberg conflict barometer is a very useful resource because they actually look at all of the actors. They look at state, non-state. And so if you're trying to think about what are the, how to think about Nigeria, I would start with the Heidelberg Index. I actually think that is underused by researchers too, trying to think about how can we integrate different measures of violence. There's a number of nonprofits that really try to look at different measures of violence. If we'd had more time, I was going to pull up some maps to show that the US, for example, comes up as a fairly violent country, even though we don't have an armed conflict, in part because of our high military spending, but also because of police violence and the high murder rates and the high gun rates. So there are some very good measures of violence that don't necessarily focus on state violence, but really try to comprehensively look at these things. And I actually had a slide on that, but it somehow got deleted. So I'm going to try to pull it up and share because I have a bunch of links, if that would be helpful. The other comment I wanted to make, actually, Yelda, your comments were really helpful. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about food security and inflation and also employment. And one of the things that we do know is the role of sanctions. Sanctions definitely makes the impact of inflation worse. And it also has negative impacts on female labor force participation. My work has shown that in Iran, in Iraq, and in Palestine, economic isolation has actually made women less able to engage in the labor market. So I think more work needs to be done around that triangulation. But I really agree with you. The food security and the inflation mechanism are really important to think about. So those are my two comments for now. Oh, no, I also had the question, you had the question about the long-term impacts. So I just published a paper with Caitlin Killian, where we trace what happens to reproductive health spending during a conflict and after a conflict. And the empirical evidence is, we sort of piece together some data. And what happens is during conflict, everybody's aware that reproductive health is important. And so there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that maternal mortality is being addressed, making sure that thinking about contraceptive care. But post-conflict, that completely drops off the radar screen. So that's a good example where women and men are going to have very different gendered needs in a post-conflict context. And we don't really emphasize healthcare. And I want to then talk about Haroon's point. Absolutely. I mean, for me, the sustainability, the reason I bring it into sustainability is because I do see this as an intergenerational problem. And it's true that that trauma itself, now we're seeing the intergenerational. And again, I feel like post-conflict, there's not enough emphasis on mental health. One of the things that Anne-Marie Gotts talks about is how a lot of post-conflict is just paying off the spoilers. So you're really worried about your young men with guns because you don't want them to start fighting again. And so a lot of resources go towards trying to help them. But the people who are also being impacted, but very indirectly, don't get the same kind of attention. So I would say reproductive health spending and mental health spending are two things that are, I think, underinvested in And I have concrete proof of that for reproductive, but I'm just asserting that it's probably true for mental health as well. I don't have evidence to support that.
Thank you. Adem, would you like to comment? And then we have one question for Yelda that she can answer. It is on chat. Yes, please.
Actually, I don't have much to talk about the role of non-state actors, but I would sort of myself would like to think it in the context of actually military-industrial complex. I will come back to that point. I know it's sort of another issue. In terms of the other questions, also, honestly, I'm not sure if I understood her right, but I think it is very important because when it comes to fiscal policy, if they counteract to the impact of military spending on economic growth or other macroeconomic indicators, I think in that regard, we need to emphasize the role of advanced welfare states. Again, because it is basically what I'm trying to do, again, I would like to use an example from this macroeconomic, like the studies in the defense and peace economics. So there's a great sizable literature just focuses on the trade-off between social expenditures and military expenditures. And some studies actually interestingly found that increasing military spending, for example, doesn't increase income inequality, or they don't actually crowd out health expenditures and education expenditures. And basically, this happens in the countries, either they are very rich, that means they have still source to increase their military spending along with social expenditures, or they do have advanced welfare states so that they can compensate the loss of the poor people. But I think, at least from my own perspective, because my presentation was, now I realize the general context of my presentation, I think it was mostly the critics of the defense and peace economics, because when it comes to, like the policy making, I think they have sort of like the dominant role. And I just realized that particularly those scholars are very behind. They are lagged. They are behind even the paradigm or the changing paradigm of policy makings. They just stick with very narrow perspective on the role, the impact of military spending. And I think that's why it is important to sort of incorporate this more humanist, I should say, perspective to that studies. It was like the one point that we need to sort of emphasize the role of welfare state in that context. If that is the answer to Yelda's question, again, maybe I totally misunderstood and responded totally something different. And another issue trying to do, is like in terms of broadening the discussion on militarization. I think another important issue is the role of military-industrial complex, financialization, and its impact on the profit rates. That's something like I'm sort of taking advantage of sort of like talking about this important issue as well, because when we look at the impact of military spending, not on economic growth, but profit rates in a country in general, there is this very clear distinction between in terms of countries who produce and sell arms and countries who import the arms, for example, Turkey or Turkey and Greece. Of course, the countries like United States, UK, they took advantage. We see a very clear, significant positive impact of military spending on the profit rates. But of course, that's just the opposite when it comes to countries like Turkey and Greece. And that's actually what I wanted to just like to emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yelda, would you like to comment on a current war in Gaza and its impact from feminist point of view?
Actually, I don't have data, or I'm not very, I don't have data and information on this. So I refrain speaking about from that topic. Maybe from the field who have made research can contribute, those people who have observations and making research can comment on that, maybe. Jennifer,
Yes.
maybe.
Jennifer,
She worked on Palestine.
any comment
Yeah.
on current situation in Gaza?
Yeah, current
Its
situation.
impact.
I mean, you know, the humanitarian cost is devastating, and there's no doubt that that's gonna. I actually think one of the things that's very frustrating is that, unfortunately, you know, Hamas is coming out actually gonna. I don't know how this is going to play out in terms of the popularity, for example, of Islamist leadership, right? So unfortunately, what we see, and I'm not just going to comment on Gaza, but what we see is in these contexts where there's a lot of social norm disruption, it's able to, that's when Islamists are actually able to put in a wedge often. So this is not specific to Gaza, but just, you know, how do people respond to trauma? Often it's turning towards religious authorities. So I think that's something that's worth reflecting on, how that's going to shift the popularity of different political groups. I know that the Israeli-Palestinian, you know, within Israel, the left is very, very unable to speak and be critical. And so it's just made it much, much harder for there to be any resolution. And I think that that the consequences for women on this are going to be really challenging, right? In terms of, we know in the context of Iraq, for example, that more conservative gender norms emerged in the context of long-term economic suffering, for example. So I worry about that for sure. I don't know if that's answering the question. I also would say, yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. Good. Go ahead.
It's fine.
Well, you're muted.
It's fine. I do want to say one more thing about, you know, this is something I emphasize with my students every time I teach these classes. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council are the biggest exporters of arms. Like, we want to put all the emphasis on the importers of arms, but we have to understand that the people who are claiming to maintain peace, the Security Council is supposed to be maintaining peace, are the biggest arms exporters. So you really can't do this country by country. You actually have to think about the interaction between the exporters and the importers and who's got the power. And I don't think econometrics is the best tool for some of these kinds of analyses, right? Because how do we think about those linkages, right? And going back to Adam's point, it doesn't surprise me that you don't see a link between gender inequality and military spending if you're a rich country, because you're using it for macroeconomic stimulation, right? You're not using it, it's not a substitute if you're a rich arms exporting country. It's actually a stimulus because you're using it to basically as a form of exports, and you're bringing in foreign currency. So you really have to treat exporters and importers very differently.
That makes sense. I also want to add in regard to non-state actors and informal military. In many countries and conflicts, we are seeing that actually the dirty work and the horrible effect on women, especially rapes and other violence, rather than happening through formal military or state, it is happening through informal. So basically everyone can deny what they have been involved in. And that has also devastating effect on women and children, and also boys and men who have been affected. Any other questions or last comments? Any participants or speakers would like to add? We have 10 more minutes. So it seems we don't have any more questions.
I want to apologize because there was a request for the link. Haroon put the name Heidelberg Conflict Barometer. I'm trying to post the link, and I'm not, for some reason, My computer's not allowing me to do paste, but oh, there it goes. It finally did it. So I just sent the link. Another good, useful, like the SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is another good data set around this. So people can email me offline too at jolmsted@drew.edu. I have a lot of resources. I teach political economy of war and peace and Middle East development, and I have a lot of links that I'd be happy to share and some articles if people want to just reach out to me offline.
Thank you. Any last comment, Adem or Yelda?
Maybe again, very general comments, particularly based on Jennifer's comment when she mentioned about this role of the countries, both in terms of like the arms exporters and importers. I think it is. I mean, I don't know if it is the right way as a scholar to tell this, but it's a very depressive when I think of the role of the military-industrial complex. In fact, I think it is better way to put it, as many people says, the global military-industrial complex, because when we look at the relationship between this global military-industrial complex and their sort of local representatives, it seems it works, quote unquote, works unfortunately very well. I'm telling this particularly in the context of, let's say, Turkey, the Turkish military-industrial complex, its contribution to the war in Ukraine and Russia as a part of sort of global military-industrial complex. In that sense, I think we have a huge responsibility to perhaps provide, discuss more and absolutely in both at macro level. It's just like I wanted to add that, it's like it is very important to understand the operation of those global military-industrial complex. That was all. Thanks so much. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you have anything?
Yeah, there was one other link I wanted to share, which is the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index is the one that doesn't just look at armed conflict, but it looks at how many guns there are in the country, how much police violence there is, and that's the one that I just posted that in the chat as well. That's another useful index that people might find helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you all. Thanks to all our fabulous, wonderful speakers that did very good discussion, and our participants. Thank you for your time. And hopefully we are going to come back with more panels like this, or I would say focus on MENA region and basically the situation for women and gender inequality there.